Imagine that you were just given $100 million. That is an absolutely life-changing amount of money. You could pretty much do and buy anything that you wanted, but now imagine having that much money and literally throwing it all away into the trash. It would be an absolute nightmare, and it's exactly what happened to the man we are going to talk about today, James Howells, the man who threw away $100 million. Let's go back all the way to the year 2008. At the time, James Howells was a young man in his early 20s. He was living in the small Welsh town of Newport. Just like everyone else at the time, he was dealing with the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis. This led him on a search to understand how our current financial system works. And after doing some reading, he became extremely skeptical. Fast forward to early 2009, and James had discovered Bitcoin, and he was instantly hooked. Like many, he saw Bitcoin as a potential way to fix many of the problems that our current financial system has. Now, if you're familiar with Bitcoin, then you'll know how crazy it is to have discovered it in 2009. You really couldn't have been any earlier. Bitcoin launched in early January of 2009 and was completely worthless. No one knew what it was or how it worked. It would be several years before the price of one Bitcoin even hit $1. Yet here James was, in a position that many of us have dreamed of being in, and he used that position to his advantage. Soon after discovering Bitcoin, he started running it on his computer. He claimed that there were so few people running the software at the time that he was only able to connect to 6 or 7 other nodes, meaning he was likely one of only a handful of other people running the software. It also meant he was likely connected directly to the node hosted by Bitcoin's creator, Satoshi Nakamoto. He also had set his node to mine Bitcoin as well. This meant that the Bitcoin network would use his CPU's processing power in order to keep the network secure and honest. As a thank you for doing this, the Bitcoin network pays out a set amount of Bitcoin at the end of every block, which happens roughly every 10 minutes. Now, today Bitcoin mining requires specialized hardware that costs thousands of dollars, and on top of that, the amount of Bitcoin that is paid out every block decreases every 4 years. So as time goes on, more and more people are mining and fewer Bitcoins are being created. But in 2009, things were much simpler. James could just use his CPU on his laptop, and so few people were mining that he was getting massive payouts by today's standards. For example, today each block only pays out 6.25 Bitcoins, and typically that amount is going to be shared with hundreds or thousands of other miners. But in 2009, every block generated 50 Bitcoins, and because so few people were mining at the time, James had a really high chance of getting 50 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. So James mined Bitcoin on and off for the next several months. Some days he would mine longer than others. He was using his primary laptop to mine, so when he needed to use the laptop, he would stop mining and then he would turn it back on after he was done. Over those few months of mining, he was able to accumulate around 8,000 Bitcoins, which by today's standards is a massive fortune, but back then it was worth nothing. Around this time, James was extremely interested and involved in Bitcoin. He even claims to have made one of the first 100 Bitcoin transactions, but he did eventually stop mining due to his girlfriend at the time complaining that his laptop fan was too noisy. After that, he kind of lost interest in Bitcoin for a few years. Sometime in 2010, he ended up taking the laptop he used to mine Bitcoin apart, after he accidentally spilled lemonade all over it, but he didn't throw away the hard drive. He put it somewhere safe for future use. A few years later, in 2013, James decided to clean up his office, and while doing so, he came across 2 hard drives. One he knew was blank, and the other that he had kept from his old laptop. He decided to throw away the blank hard drive because he didn't really need it. James had never thrown away a hard drive before, and he was a very tech-savvy guy. After all, he had worked as a systems engineer, so he thought to himself that maybe throwing away the hard drive wasn't such a good idea, even if he didn't think he would need it. But by the time he had a chance to retrieve the hard drive, his partner had already taken it to the dump. Several months passed, and James had already forgotten about the incident. But then he came across this BBC News story about a Norwegian man who had made a lot of money from Bitcoin. He remembered that he too had a lot of Bitcoin that he would be able to access if he could just get his old hard drive booted up. And it made sense to do it right then because his Bitcoins would have easily been worth over $1 million at the time. So that's exactly what he did. He found his old hard drive and started looking through it, and that's when he realized that he had made the biggest mistake of his entire life. The hard drive that he had kept was the blank one. The one that he needed to access his 8,000 Bitcoins was in a dump somewhere. James contemplated going to the dump and searching for his hard drive, but explaining his situation was going to be tough, and finding the hard drive was going to be even harder. So for a month, he sat around and did nothing. And during this time, the value of Bitcoin continued to climb, in theory, making him an even richer man. So eventually he went to the dump and explained his situation. He had hoped that they may put computer parts in a specific area that he could easily look through, but that wasn't the case, and his hard drive had been compressed and then buried out in the landfill. The manager of the landfill was nice and showed him around it. After going around the landfill, James realized how massive it was, and the search seemed impossible to him. The manager even made it clear that there was basically no chance of finding his hard drive. Despite all of this, James was given some information that made him feel a little bit hopeful. Household garbage was only placed in one part of the landfill, landfill, meaning a search of the entire thing wouldn't be necessary. After going home and taking a look at the landfill on Google Maps, he realized that while he was still essentially trying to find a needle in a haystack, there was a chance that he could find his hard drive. Initially, Newport officials seemed interested in potentially returning the hard drive if it was found, but they quickly decided against allowing James to search for it. It was hard for the city to confirm any of the details of James's story, and moving all that garbage could potentially be an environmental risk. And let's say that James even did find the hard drive. How would they even know that it was still in one piece or that the data would even be able to be recovered? James, however, believed that finding the hard drive was worth doing. He also believed that there was an extremely high chance they could recover the data on it, mentioning in multiple interviews that the Space Shuttle Columbia had burned up upon re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, but 99% of the data on its black box was still able to be recovered. James has also noted that he knows the exact week that the hard drive was thrown away. This will allow the search to be narrowed down to an even smaller section of the landfill. So it isn't like the entire landfill would need to be searched, just a section. As time went on, James created a plan to retrieve his lost hard drive. He started assembling a team of people who could help him do the impossible. He also continued to reach out to his local city council, but they seemed completely uninterested in helping his situation, even after he offered them a 10% cut of the total Bitcoin. Years passed and still very little progress was made, and during this time, the price of Bitcoin continued to rise. What was originally $1 million had ballooned into hundreds of millions. In 2017, the price of Bitcoin even reached $19,000 per coin, making those 8,000 Bitcoins worth over $150 million, yet the city council still showed no interest. As the years went on, the city council continued to reject James's proposals to look for the hard drive, and James continued to do whatever he could to make the project more appealing to the city council. His team expanded to add individuals who could make the process go much smoother. He has people who are experts with landfills, those who are experts at sorting through massive amounts of trash. He has a data recovery expert, and most importantly, he has investors willing to cover the cost for the project. Yet the city still says it's a no-go. In 2021, he was once again given the chance to talk to members of the council over Zoom, but they were still completely uninterested, with one member stating, "You know, Mr. Howes, there's absolutely zero appetite for this project to go ahead with the Newport City Council." He's even more recently offered the city a 25% cut that they could have as a COVID relief fund, but still nothing. He has also mentioned that he wants to help make the relatively small town of Newport a crypto mecca, and that it could help to bring them into the 21st century, but they still don't seem to care. Fast forward to 2022 and James Howes is still fighting to get his Bitcoin back. He seems as eager as ever, and now has a more refined plan that will cost his investors $11 million. This new and improved plan even adds Boston Dynamic robot dogs to help out in the search. In the same Business Insider article that broke that information about James's new plan, the city council also made a comment. Nothing that Mr. Howes could present to us could convince the council to let him access the site. They also said, "His proposals pose significant ecological risk, which we cannot accept and indeed are prevented from considering by the terms of our permit." So the city's stance has been the same for nearly a decade now. Under no circumstances will they let him look for his hard drive. James still holds out hope that eventually, as the price of Bitcoin rises, it will become an offer they can't refuse. But that hasn't been the case yet, even with James's Bitcoin being worth over $500 million at some points in 2021. As I started researching the story, I thought it would be one of a man that was desperate for something that could have been. And to some degree it is. James Howes accidentally threw away a lot of money, and it has consumed his life for the last decade. But that's only half of the story. The other half is him fighting against his own city council, and as time has gone on, that fight has gotten more absurd. I can understand why they didn't want him doing it in 2013. He was just one guy with a story that they couldn't even verify. But he now has a team that could safely and effectively do this. He has funding. He has investors willing to take on the risk that the city was afraid of. It's also unlikely that he is just making up his story at this point. He has been working at retrieving this Bitcoin for nearly a decade now, letting it consume his life. That's not something someone with a made-up story would likely do. He is even willing to give them massive amounts of the fortune, and he wants to help build new and exciting businesses within their town. Yet they don't even give him a chance, citing the ecological risk that his search poses. To be fair, I don't know what sort of ecological risk that this would pose, but with a team behind him willing to take that into consideration and do things to the city council's liking, they could vastly mitigate that risk. The whole situation just seems odd to me when this could likely be a massive win for both the city and James. Unfortunately, this fight seems like it will continue for years to come, but I hope that one day James Howes is able to look for the missing hard drive and finally get some closure.